Okay, does everyone see that, the presentation? Is it, I'm gonna make this larger.
That's how it starts.
Can everyone see?
Yeah, can you see this? Is it everyone see the slides? I'm trying to make it full screen.
Yes.
Yep, if you click on slideshow, that should do it.
Should put it on a slideshow? Where is it?
Click on slideshow, up at the top.
No, it's on normally, behind you, slideshow.
Multiple screens, right. It depends on what kind of work you want to do.
There you go. Click on, yep, from the beginning.
Okay.
Okay. That's great.
Let's see, whatever you
They need to
want.
bring that stuff back into the schools.
Okay, we'll move us to these, so everyone mute while we're doing the presentation, and then he's gonna answer questions at the end, or, okay, so.
Ready? Okay. So thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here this evening for this presentation about starting a small business or nonprofit. As mentioned, my name is Dominique Carroll, and I'm with the law firm Fox Rothschild. Next slide, please. Next. Next slide, please. Okay, yep. Just some brief information about Fox Rothschild. We're a large law firm of about 1,000 attorneys, 27 offices coast to coast. My practice involves a lot of working with businesses and individuals that are starting companies and that have established companies. So helping them with their formation, their startup documents, being their source of information for legal needs. I also handle intellectual property, so that's copyrights, patents, and trademarks for my clients, as well as litigation. So those are some of the main areas that I work on. So for tonight, we're going to be talking with a primary focus on businesses, starting new companies, and also nonprofits. And so I'll be giving some general information about those topics, but I would add that it's important for anyone that's thinking about starting a business, or if you have questions regarding the business that you have going on currently, it's important to talk to other professionals such as an accountant, also such as an attorney, because there can be different tax and legal issues that are unique to your situation. So while I can provide some general information, each business is unique, each individual situation is unique also. Next slide, please.
Dominique, can you speak up a little bit, because we can't hear?
Oh, sure. Let me, sorry about that. Are you able to hear me? Is it any better?
We can hear you okay here online, at least. I'm not sure if it's the volume in the THA or what.
What can you say, Michael? Because you're low too, so I'm wondering if something here going on.
We can hear just fine online, at least Stacy. Can you confirm that? Can you hear okay, Stacy?
I'll talk a little bit up.
It's a little bit quiet. I feel like if you could speak a little more directly into the microphone, that might help.
Sure.
But yeah, I know. Get cozy.
All right. Okay, so starting off with just some basic information regarding reasons to form a corporate entity. One reason, limited liability, which I'm sure people in the room have heard of. What that gets to is the concept of trying to limit your potential liability in terms of what you can owe for, let's say, debts or potential lawsuits against the company. And also to give you, an example, there's different types of corporate entities you could form. You can have a C corporation, you can have an LLC, which are very common, but people can also just go out to be a sole proprietor without really following those formalities. But the issue that might arise is if you have you start a business as a sole proprietor, you don't have limited liability. And just to give you an example, what that means is if you start a sole proprietorship, there's no legal separation between you and the company. So if there are debts or there's a lawsuit that's brought against the business, you potentially could be liable for that debt or for those claims, because the business is not a separate legal company, it's just you. And so that means that a person or a company could go against, try to get your personal assets, let's say, for example, your car, your other businesses, your personal savings, compared to if you have some type of entity form with limited liability, potentially the amount that people can recover can be limited to the assets of that business. So that's what we're referring to when I say limited liability. And that also goes hand in hand with the second bullet point, asset protection. So another reason to potentially think about forming a corporate entity is to have asset protection to protect the assets that you have that are owned by the business, to keep them segregated from your personal assets. And even if you have multiple businesses, you can potentially form separate entities to have those separate assets protected. So for example, if you have company A and company B, if you have the right procedures in place, liabilities and claims against company A might not be able to jeopardize the separate company, company B. So that's what we're talking about, having separate corporate entities for reasons such as limiting your personal liability and also asset protection. And for the third point on this slide, where it talks about piercing the corporate veil, what that means is once you have certain legal entities that are formed, like let's say you have an LLC or you have a C corporation and you're following the proper procedures, if you're doing things the right way in terms of meetings, in terms of documentation, in terms of funding your business, courts normally, except in certain situations, they're not going to pierce the corporate veil. What that means is, let's say you have an LLC that you formed. Normally, they're not going to pierce the LLC's corporate form to hold you as an individual liable for debts or liabilities of the company. So that's what we're talking about when we say courts are reluctant to pierce the corporate veil. When you have the right formalities in place for a separate legal entity, typically the courts are not going to go behind that entity to hold the individual owners personally liable compared to holding potentially the company liable. Next slide. And again, going to some of the advantages of having limited liability, a potential, you can have a large class action lawsuits where you can have multiple claims brought against the company, and those can have very large potential awards or judgments. And you don't want those type of judgments against you personally if you can have it segregated and only against the company. Catastrophic tort claims, depending on the type of products that you're sold. Sometimes there might be, let's say, there's a personal injury from a result of a product that is sold. You don't want to have some of those catastrophic torts where, let's say, somebody might lose a limb or they might be significantly injured, or even without loss of a limb, let's say someone has a very substantial slip and fall at your premises and it exceeds your insurance. You want to have limited liability. So again, if there's a significant claim, they're not going to be able to go after you as an individual compared to bringing claims against the company that will have the limited liability. Next slide. Asset protection, again, just minimizing the amount that creditors, which would be people that are owed by the company, that they can recover from the company. So having the asset protection in place would also help in terms of being protected from piercing the corporate veil, which we were talking about. When you have the right type of entities formed and there's limited liability, the courts are generally not going to pierce a corporate veil. So there might be debts and obligations of the company that are owed, but you wouldn't be held individually liable. Now, that doesn't mean somebody might not try to sue you in your individual capacity, but if you have the right legal entities in place, you can minimize their ability to be successful and bring a claim against the owners of the company individually. Next slide. Are we going back to the slideshow? Or... Sorry about the technical difficulty.
Bad connection.
Okay. Can everyone see the screen?
Yeah. Is the right one?
Okay, yes. So there are more types of entities, but some of the most common: limited liability company, commonly referred to as an LLC, C corporation, S corp, limited partnership, and nonprofit. And this slide, especially, let's take the limited liability company example first. This highlights another reason why it's important to talk to other professionals, consult with an attorney or an accountant, because there can be different requirements in different states. Just to give you a quick example, for a limited liability company, just comparing New Jersey to New York. In New York, if you file for a limited liability company, New York has a special rule where you actually have to do what's called publication. So you have to have notice of the formation of the company published in 2 newspapers for several weeks. And you also have to give proof of the publication and then file that and pay an additional fee, compared to most other states where you don't have to do that publication requirement. And so, it's good to find the information that's specific to the state where you're incorporating your business, because there can be unique rules that are in place that you want to make sure that you're following so that your company is protected. And, one size doesn't fit all. Each entity has its own tax and legal consequences and potential considerations, which you should think about prior to forming the company. But if you already have your business up and running, it's still a good idea to go out and get that information from other qualified professionals. Next slide. And so we're talking about starting a business or not-for-profit. So what's the difference legally? This is a very common question. So, next slide. Okay, a very, very simplified definition of profit is when your revenues or your income are in excess, they're more than your expenses. Next slide. So for-profit, you're going to have a business that has an intention, a goal of making and distributing those profits. So assuming that you have profits, there are different ways that they can be distributed. So let's say you have a C corporation, which is a very common type of corporation. You might have shareholders, and the board might decide to pay out dividends. So that's one way of distributing profits to the owners of the company. And so that's something that a for-profit company like a C corporation would be able to do. They would be able to distribute some of their profits to the shareholders of the owners of the company. Next slide. Compared to a not-for-profit, which has the intention of making but not distributing the profit. And we'll give a little more detail about that as we go on. So, next slide. So a for-profit entity such as an LLC, which is going to have typically pass-through tax considerations, so that's going to be a taxable entity. A nonprofit doesn't necessarily equal tax exempt, but it can have a tax exempt status at the federal level, but there can be some nuance there. There's some unrelated business income for the nonprofit. But generally, the for-profit is going to be taxable. It might be at the corporate level. It might just be at the individual level and they're on the individual's tax returns, or it might be a combination, which is referred to as the double taxation. Next slide. And just want to jump in real quick and just say I appreciate everybody's patience. I'm going through the slides. I will definitely have time for questions, and so you won't just have to hear me talking and reading the slides the entire time. But I just wanted to go through some of the foundational elements which might spark some additional questions later on in the presentation. And so again, we're talking about the difference between business entities, for-profit and not-for-profit. So as we discussed, the business entity can distribute the profits while a non-profit organization would not. There's differences in transferring property and even in terms of compensation. So a tax-exempt organization, of course, can pay a reasonable compensation to employees, but a business entity can pay significantly more if that's what's determined by the people that are running the organization. Next slide. So another common difference would be donations. And so here I'm talking about the 501c3, which is a very common type of nonprofit for organizations that have purposes that are charitable, religious, scientific, literary, or educational purposes. And so if you meet the right requirements and you file the proper paperwork with the IRS, you could potentially get a letter back from the IRS stating that you have the tax exempt status for your federal income, and which also helps in terms of receiving grants from private foundations and the government, which a lot of private business entities and for-profit companies are not generally eligible for. And another consideration where we're talking about the distinction between a for-profit business entity compared to a nonprofit, how are you going to get money? How are you going to start the business? Are you going to use private investors? And if you're going to use private investors, are you intending to give them an equity stake, meaning shares of a corporation, membership interest of an LLC, making them a part owner in exchange for the equity that they're giving to the business? If that's what you're thinking of doing, then the consideration is for some type of for-profit entity compared to a tax-exempt organization such as a 501c3 nonprofit. Next slide. And again, sources of revenue, which is a very understandable and important question for people that are thinking about starting up a new business. Are you going to use grants from private foundations? Then you need to check your eligibility requirements to see if you would be eligible to have your nonprofit tax exempt status recognized by the IRS, or would it make more sense for you to give out ownership interests in the company in exchange for startup capital for your business. Also think about what type of business are you going to have? Are you going to be selling goods and services? Or are you going to have some type of charitable purpose for the business that you're trying to run? If you're going to make profits and operating revenues from selling goods or services, you might want to consider a for-profit business entity. If you're thinking that your operating revenue, which means money that helps you fund the business, keep the business going on a day-to-day and a long-term duration, if you think about doing that from contributions or from grants, you might want to consider forming a nonprofit entity. Next slide. And so this is just getting into, you want to have a checklist. Think about not only what are my sources of revenue, but what type of activities will this business typically conduct? Do we have charitable events that we're typically going to conduct and generate revenues from there? Or is it going to be educational activities, literary activities, or are the activities going to be primarily commercial? Again, that helps you make that threshold decision. Do I want to form a for-profit business entity, or do I want to have a nonprofit? Next slide. And so we spent a lot of time, well, I spent a lot of time so far talking about for-profit business entities, but just to give you a little bit more information regarding nonprofits. And just to recap, a nonprofit, that doesn't mean that they will not generate profits. So it may or may not generate profit. But it's important to think about whether or not the business is going to be distributing profits to the owners. So if you have a nonprofit, you're not going to be paying shareholders dividends or distributing profits to them in that way. You don't have owners or shareholders. Now you're going to have directors that are going to help. You're going to have a board that will help with strategic decisions and help. You likely will have an executive director for your organization. You may have members, but their rights would be conferred in documents what we call bylaws, which are essentially documents which help with the way the company is run and the way the company is governed. So it's going to set out, you can think about a lot of rules and regulations for the operation of your company. Bylaws are also something that happen in the for-profit realm, because you can have a corporation that will adopt bylaws, but that's also similar for nonprofits. So if you have, let's say, a charitable organization, or like I'm on the Capital Region Minority Chamber of Commerce, we have bylaws for our nonprofit organization as well. And again, the nonprofit can pay reasonable compensation compared to a for-profit entity, which has the ability to pay significantly higher amounts. Next slide, please. And just to give you an example, there's different types of regulation. So if you have a nonprofit, there's going to be state level regulation, going with your formation of the entity, taxes that you're going to have to pay, duties of the directors. There's fundraising that comes into play. And then also you have to apply for the tax exempt status with the IRS, filing the form, the 1023, if you're going for a 501c3. So there's different regulation at the state and the federal level that you have to think about if you're going with a nonprofit. Next slide, please. And so what I've alluded to, there are different types of nonprofits. 501c3, which a lot of people have heard of for educational, religious, scientific, charitable organizations. There can be a 501c4 for social welfare organizations. That can be like a local organization of employees. You can have a 501c3 for business leagues and trade associations. So that would be similar to, let's say, a chamber of commerce. There can be social clubs. So there are different types of nonprofits, but common exemption is sought under the 501c3 status. Next slide, please. And we had talked about this a few times, some of the advantages for having the 501c3, exemption from federal income tax, and also the ability for donors to claim a charitable deduction. But for this to qualify as a 501c3, again, operated for religious, charitable, scientific, educational, or literary purpose primarily. Those are some of the main categories that you will fall under if you're trying to qualify under the 501c3 status. Next slide, please. Just a surprising fact. Of course, it's a valuable ability for a nonprofit to not have to pay income tax, but it's also a valuable attribute for it to be able to claim charitable contributions and that deduction, which is a way of incentivizing some donors to make contributions to your nonprofit organization, which will be important for those operating funds and to keep your nonprofit going. You will need fundraising is the lifeblood of many nonprofits. It's incredibly important, and so being able to offer that charitable contribution deduction to donors is a very attractive feature of nonprofits. Next slide, please. And so this, again, just what we talked about earlier, piercing the corporate veil. So let's say, use an example again, let's say you formed a corporation and somebody brings a lawsuit against the corporation. Let's say they say you breached the contract, and you made some statements, which was defamation. They're bringing all types of claims against the company. They're saying that you were negligent. So if you have, excuse me, the separation between the individual and the business, then generally their claims are going to be against the business as a separate legal entity compared to them going after the owners of the company personally and trying to get to make judgments from their personal assets. So that's piercing the corporate veil. Piercing the corporate veil would mean that you're holding a shareholder or an owner of the corporation personally liable for obligations, debts, other types of liabilities of the corporation. Generally, you're not able to do that, but in some specific instances, a court will hold the owner of the company potentially personally liable. Next slide. One of the main reasons that will happen would be if there are allegations or someone actually engages in fraud or bad faith. That can be a way that leads a court to piercing the corporate veil, or at a minimum, allowing a lawsuit to go forward, naming somebody individually. Because normally if somebody's suing a company, they'll sue the company in the company's name. They wouldn't be suing the individual owners of the company or the directors. Now, sometimes that does happen. One way that will happen where there are allegations of fraud or bad faith on the part of those owners or directors. A couple of other reasons are misuse of funds. So let's say you have two companies that are separate businesses, but your company A is not doing very well, raising revenue, but company B is doing very well. And there's manipulation and siphoning of money from company B to company A, that to the detriment of one company. That can lead to claims where owners of the company are saying, of company A are saying, well, hey, company B, which was doing better, are going to say, well, hey, we're being harmed here. You're taking money and revenue that you can distribute back to us, those profits, and you're giving it to the separate company to our detriment. So failure to observe corporate formalities, that goes to not filing the proper paperwork, not have, let's say, for example, you have a corporation. If you have a C corporation, normally you need to have an annual meeting. You should have a board of directors. You should have bylaws. You should have a separate business account for that entity. If you're not following all the proper corporate formalities, people might bring a claim and say, well, I understand that you filed this corporation, but you're not following the proper legal procedures to maintain your corporation. So now I'm going to try and hold the owners of the corporation personally liable. So that's why it's important to talk again to those professionals, talk to your accountant, talk to an attorney to make sure that you know what are the legal obligations of your specific legal entity and to make sure that you're consistently following them. Next slide, please. Okay, so enough of me directly talking. Now I get to hear if there are any questions. Unless I put everybody to sleep.
I have a question.
Okay.
All right, so let's say you said that something about for nonprofits. Can you do they do charitable work? Can you do charitable work or like get tax write-off for a business that's not nonprofit, like that's a regular business? Let's say I cut hair or something, but I give out free haircuts to the kids, students, or whatever. Like, will that be considered like a tax write-off, or would I have to go about a certain type of way? Or if I sell food and I give out platters, you see what I'm saying? Can that be tax write-off?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but trying to get the tax exempt status, that's not typically a one-off thing. That's a process. So for example, let's say, I'll give you an example where you have a regular corporation and you have a nonprofit. So they're going to be similar when you form them. Let's say you form each one as a C corporation. Okay. What would happen where you go from the C corporation to the nonprofit? You have to file a special form with the IRS. After you form your company, you have to file the form with the IRS, and then you have to get the exemption granted from the IRS. So if you don't have that exemption, you haven't filed the paperwork with the IRS, and you haven't gotten a sign off from the IRS, you don't have a nonprofit that's a tax exempt. You still have a for-profit company where that doesn't mean that you can't do things that are, that have social or societal goals in mind, but there is a difference between having and running a nonprofit compared to running a for-profit that can have, let's say, a good mission statement to do good for society. But there's, having the tax exempt status, that's a certain status that's from the government, from the IRS specifically.
So basically, having a regular business, not a nonprofit, a regular for-profit business, to get it tax exempt is pretty hard unless you like form paperwork. I guess you gotta get an okay from it, or you can't get one if you.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But what I'm saying is, I wouldn't say that it's hard. It depends on, one, what type of business you're running and what category you're falling into. So again, if we're going back to the example for the 501c3, does your business have a primary purpose of educational purpose, scientific purpose, a charitable purpose, or is this a typical for-profit business? But then you're saying like, hey, I want tax exempt status. So that's different. Those are two different business models compared to how you're running your company as a for-profit, where you're trying to make profit and potentially distribute that to the owners, compared to you have a nonprofit where you're running this organization for these perhaps charitable or other goals, and then you might make a profit, but your goal is not to make and distribute that profit. So I guess the best way to think about it, there's two different business models that it seems like you're talking about. One which would be more of a typical for-profit model compared to a nonprofit where you're going through the proper channels and you're getting that approval from the IRS.
In your experience, which business like have you seen prosper more, profit or nonprofit?
I have to give you the typical attorney answer. It depends. And the reason I say that is, just from personal experience. So you can have a very successful for-profit. I think Amazon's doing pretty well. But then you can also have a very successful not-for-profit. So not-for-profits, there's also a lot of disclosure requirements for a nonprofit. And so I can say this because it's public information. So I'm on the board of a local nonprofit, young audiences, of New Jersey and Eastern Pennsylvania. So this is a well-established nonprofit entity, and you can go online and see their finances. So I'm not disclosing anything that's not public information, but this is a well-run nonprofit that has very significant operating revenues. So they have operating revenues which are larger than a lot of other companies, but they've been around for a significant amount of time. They have a lot of mobilized donors that believe in their mission. They have a lot of private funding. They have funding from foundations. They get a lot of grant funding. So they can have, so you can have a nonprofit that has literally millions of dollars in operating funds. You can have a nonprofit that has hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in securities that they have in assets. So you can have a very successful nonprofit, but it's going to take time. It's going to take a lot of dedication, and it's going to take a lot of fundraising and building a coalition around that nonprofit. So I can say that there are some nonprofits that are more organized and more well run than some for-profit businesses, and that have better balance sheets than for-profit businesses. So it's not an apples to apples comparison. You can have a very successful for-profit business. You can have a very successful nonprofit. You can have a for-profit that goes bankrupt, and you can have a nonprofit that's mismanaged. So it really depends on, especially with the nonprofit, the executive director that you have, the board that you have. Does everybody have the same mission? Is everybody aligned? Are they taking steps to make sure that decisions are made that are in line with that organization's mission statement, that they're staying true to that, that they're adequately managing the funds, there's no financial irregularities. So there's a lot that goes into it, because again, let's say whether you have a for-profit or a nonprofit, reputation matters. Today where a tweet can go viral, there can be a video that's shared. So it's important to maintain that integrity and run your business, whether it's a nonprofit or for-profit, the right way, because you can have some very substantial downturn for your business, whether it's a for-profit or a not-for-profit. So it really depends on who's running the business.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
You're
That was a very lawyer answer right there. I ain't gonna lie. That was a very lawyer answer. It wasn't
been a
straight,
lawyer for
but
a
I
long
got the picture.
time, so
I got
it's
the
hard
picture right.
not to.
Right.
Are you okay? Do we have any other questions?
I have one quick question. Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, Renee, you want to ask?
Hi. First of all, thank you for discussing this important information. In reference to the nonprofit, why does the process of the 501c3 take so long?
I couldn't, it's just a little hard to hear. I heard you say something about the 501c3, but that the trail end of your question, I couldn't hear it.
Why does it take so long to obtain? Once you began the process of, putting together, I guess, a skeleton board of directors, a board, and then submitting the information through, why does it take so long? Takes so long.
Yeah, it's not as easy as just forming an LLC, just pay the fee, fill out a little bit of paperwork, and you're up and running in a few minutes. Right, so it's not that easy. Well, it's partial, so there's multiple reasons. So one, you already talked about, and you kind of hinted at, getting that board of directors, especially for a nonprofit, that's incredibly important. And so the one, you're going to have to look at the state that you're forming your nonprofit to figure out, okay, what's the minimum number of directors that I need for a nonprofit in this particular state, because it can vary. So once you figure that out, then you need to find those initial directors. You're typically going to want to have bylaws that are written. So you might get an attorney to do that. So that's another process, electing the directors. And then also, which is somewhat out of your control, is the time that's going to take the IRS to receive the form after you file for the tax exempt status and to turn it around and get it back to you. Now that can be a function of a lot of things. It could depend on, the funding and the staffing at the IRS at the time that it happens. So it really varies. One of the biggest time constraints, or one of the biggest bottlenecks would be the IRS once they get the form, them getting back to you whether or not the tax exempt status is granted. But especially with the nonprofit, where you're trying to get some of those very attractive benefits, such as the tax exempt status and the charitable donation deduction, that does take time. And so some of that would be internal in terms of getting the nonprofit together, getting the directors, but then there would be those other external factors, such as the government compliance and getting a response. So all of that mixes in to take longer than just going on to the Secretary of State's website and filing for an LLC or corporation, comparatively speaking. So there's other type of business entities that you can get up within, a few minutes or less than an hour, compared to a nonprofit, which is going to take significantly more time. It could take weeks, could take months. So there are a lot more internal things that you have to get in place, and then there's also, again, the government. There's more of a interplay with the government compared to just filing the paperwork for an LLC and paying the fee, compared to trying to get tax exempt status. Those are two very different processes.
Just a second part question. Delaware, the state of Delaware, even though I operated business in New York, I was able to file, but then the recent acknowledgement, as you mentioned, about the LLC for New York, and the process is more in depth. Can you file a nonprofit in the state of Delaware to operate in the state of New Jersey?
Well, so I think there's, just to make sure I get your question. So you're talking about, so there's different things between the state of formation of your business entity, whether it's an LLC or not-for-profit. You're going to have to comply with the state regulations. And so, Delaware is very popular for a lot of reasons. So a lot of good reasons. And then, so Delaware is very popular for formation of companies. That could be a whole nother topic. But so there's difference between forming your company and then where you're actually operating. So, there are large companies that form in Delaware. They might have a registered office there, but they do their day-to-day business in New York, in New Jersey, in Arizona. And so there's going to be compliance requirements with those other states. So you can form your entity in one state and you can operate solely in there, or you can operate in other states, but there are going to be compliance requirements in the other states. Normally you're going to have to file paperwork and make sure that the state knows that you're doing business in these other states. So you're not confined to having to doing business solely within the state that you form. There are people that operate businesses completely in New York, but they formed in, let's say, Wyoming or Nevada or Delaware. So there are certain states that are very popular for forming businesses, but people operate those businesses in states outside of where they form them all the time.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
If you want to go online and do business just online, do you have to have the LLC and all that for online businesses?
So just to step back, so it depends on what you want to do. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the limited liability. Now you can decide, hey, I'm not going to form a corporate entity. I'm just going to run it as a sole proprietorship. I'm just going to have a general partnership. Or you can say, I want to form an LLC so I can have that legal separation between me and the company. So that's one question, figuring out, do you want to form a company, or do you not want to form a separate legal entity? You know, that's one question. And then there's another question of how it's going to operate. So I think what you're getting at is saying, you know, let's say I have some type of business where I'm doing a lot of sales virtually. Maybe you have a physical store present, maybe you don't, but your question, how you operate your business is one thing, but I think what you have to also think about is, one, are you going to form a separate legal entity for that business, or are you going to operate it as a sole proprietorship or a general partnership where you don't have to do the exact same filing procedures as if you were forming an LLC for your business? But that's the one, first question would be, do you want to have a separate legal entity? Does that make sense for what you're trying to do? Or are you going to say, I don't want to form a separate legal entity. I'm okay with, let's say, for example, doing a sole proprietorship and having potentially unlimited personal liability. So I think the first question is to figure out, do you want to have a separate legal entity for the business that you're going to run? And then thinking about the mechanics of how you're going to run the business and which states you're going to register to do business in. So I think it's at a minimum, in two broad categories, there's business entity or not forming a business entity. And then there's a separate question of actually how you're going to run your business on a day-to-day basis.
Okay.
I got a question. So how do you become a separate entity from your corporation?
I heard the first part you said, how do you become a separate entity? I missed the last part of the question.
If it's my corporation, how do I not be liable for my corporation?
I don't know that you can take.
LLC.
So she's asking.
He's saying,
He's saying that you can be separate from your company, right?
Right.
Mm-hmm. I don't understand how that works.
She wants you to explain how can you be separate from your own company?
Okay, yeah. So let me use an example. Let's say for an LLC. And when I say separate from your company, I mean, so let's think about a business. A business is really is an individual or a collection of individuals that are operating a business. Now, legally, if you file certain paperwork, the way the government and the courts are going to look at it, they're going to say, okay, you're not, let's use me for an example. So let's say I wanted to start a towing business, right? And I was doing, I didn't form an entity. I'm just running a towing business by myself as an individual. I go out, I lease some tow trucks, and I hire some workers, and I start my towing business, right? But I haven't formed a legal entity with the state. Now, let's say one of my tow truck drivers, they get into a very serious accident and somebody's significantly injured. Now, that person brings a lawsuit, and let's say I have Carol's Towing, right? And so let's say they sue Carol's Towing, but I never formed a separate legal entity with the state. Then potentially that person is going to say, okay, well, I'm owed money, I have damages, I'm going to sue you as an individual because you don't have a separate legal company. So then they're going to try and go after potentially my personal assets, car, my home, other savings, compared to if I filed for, let's say, an LLC. Now, if I filed the paperwork with the state, articles of organization, and I paid the appropriate fee, then Carol's Towing LLC would be viewed as a separate legal entity compared to Dominique Carroll, the individual. And so that's what I was getting at when I'm talking about you as an individual running a business compared to when you file the certain paperwork with the state, and then the business is seen as a separate legal entity. The business will be seen as separate from you as an individual. That doesn't mean you're prevented from being involved in the business or from being an owner. It just means normally the individual owners are viewed as separate from the company. The company is seen as a separate legal entity. The company can do business, the company can be sued in its own name compared to you as an individual. Hopefully that provides a little clarification.
Yeah. I was just thinking that I wouldn't be liable.
Yeah, I guess, so that's why we're talking about the limited liability for having, for example, an LLC or a corporation. So that's one of the big draws of going from, let's say, a sole proprietorship compared to having an LLC, because yes, nobody wants to be personally liable. I agree. And Stacy, I think you've been very patient. I think you have a question.
I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to folks who, you know, they have a great idea. They've been wanting to start a business for some time, perhaps, but you know, all of the costs that are involved at the beginning of getting a business off the ground. So are there resources available that you know of that, you know, they can help kind of walk you through some of those first few steps of, these are the basics that you really need to cover to get that business up and running, to protect yourself, you know, to create that entity, but that aren't budget breakers, you know, are there that you know of, and are there any particular like key things at a minimum that you should do if you just want to get sort of, again, thinking of a small business up and running, contracting business, that kind of thing?
Well, I think one thing is definitely ask questions. So talk to other business owners. So get input from them. Also go to events like this event here. So you have different organizations that are going to be hosting events in different cities and different areas. So be on the lookout for those. I know we talked about briefly chambers of commerce. So I know there are a lot of active chambers of commerce in most counties that have a lot of lunch and learn series, which are typically free, or sometimes it might be a small fee where you can learn about different topics, forming a business, raising capital. I know there've been a lot of recent lunch and learns from different organizations about, you know, the PPP funding and some of the emergency disaster loans. So I think, you know, one way is just looking at local civic organizations. You know, a lot of cities have different types of programs that they're going to put on for their residents or for people that are interested, because they want to support small businesses and, you know, keep that lifeblood of the country going with the business owners. So there are resources out there, and I definitely appreciate how expensive it can be. But, you know, also doesn't hurt, you know, so you can find there might be webinars that you can sign up for, where you can have a person that's speaking regarding a topic that's of interest to you, trying to get your small business started. You might want to talk to somebody that has, you know, familiarity with grant funding, or somebody that has knowledge about different funding sources. You might want to be able to think about that as well.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Question too, right? Okay, real question here. So in regards to a franchise company, would the licensing be the same as what you started as far as what the taxing information? Was that the same in regards to when you buy into a franchise? For profit, not nonprofit, for profit, when you buy into a franchise.
Well, yeah, so I think I understand. So one thing with the franchise, so yeah, so you're going to have a for-profit business, but then there's going to be a lot of variation from one franchise to the next, depending on the agreement that you're signing. So there could be different royalty fees. There can be different startup requirements for the business. So that's going to be pretty dependent on the agreement that you're signing. So it would be very important to see what you're signing up for, how much money is going to be needed to get the business for you to be, let's say you're going to be a franchisee. You know, sometimes they'll have requirements of how much training you have to put in. So the capital that's required to become a franchisee for, let's say, McDonald's or some other type of companies can be very expensive compared to some other franchises. So it depends on, that's going to be very specific regarding the agreement that you're signing, or that the proposal that's sent to you. So it's going to be important to look at the agreement to see what the terms are in terms of capital and other contributions that you're expected to make for the business. But so it's going to be definitely for profit, but it's going to be a somewhat of a unique situation based upon the particular franchise that you're considering being a part of.
And you would suggest definitely getting a lawyer then, like having a lawyer review that. Right?
I would definitely think it would be a good idea to run that by an attorney. Because again, so when you're signing these type of agreements, they can have terms in there that you might not be familiar with. So let's just say not even just in the franchise context, but let's say somebody presents you with an agreement and it has an arbitration a binding arbitration provision in there. So just to expand this example, let's say, you're signing a contract in New Jersey with a company that's headquartered in California, right? They might have an arbitration provision in the agreement, which says, when you're signing this document, you're agreeing that any disputes between you and the company are going to be handled by binding arbitration, meaning that decision from the arbitrator is going to be final. And they can even say that the arbitration has to be conducted in California. So you might be signing a contract in New Jersey that says, if you have a dispute with the company, you have to arbitrate it in California. So just think about it, how expensive that can be for you to have to arbitrate a case outside of the state where you perhaps might be living or doing business. So I think it's definitely important to run it by an attorney when you're thinking about signing contracts, because there can be so many different terms that are thrown in there, or you could be getting yourself potentially on the hook for certain things without fully understanding what you're signing. So I would definitely recommend talking to other professionals like an attorney, especially when you're thinking about signing contracts.
How much do you charge?
That your interests are protected.
Get right to it, right? Get right to it.
How much do you charge for that? I'm interested in investing in a franchise. I know that that's something I want to do. So how much do you charge for that?
Lawyer answer number one, it depends. So so some cases are, there's different fee arrangements depending on the type of work that's involved. So I would have to speak to you, find out more about it, and then try to, come up with something that's fair and reasonable for everybody that's involved. But it really depends on the amount of time that might go into it. It depends. Sometimes it might just be, hey, somebody wants you to just look at a contract, compared to they want you to look at the contract and you see the contract is terrible and it needs to be completely done over again. And then there's a lot of back and forth negotiation. So I'm not trying to evade your question, but honestly, it really depends, and I would need more information.
I understand. Thank you.
I got a question. I know franchising sounds good because you want to get into something that's already booming and popping, right?
Yeah.
But is it a lot of risk involved?
In franchising, is there a lot of risk involved?
Well, there's a lot of risk involved in business. So again, you want to know what you're buying into. There it would be important to do your due diligence to see, okay, if this is an established business, at a minimum, like how's their revenue been going for the past few years? What about customers? What about money that the company is owed? Are they collecting on the debt that's owed to the company? Like, for example, they're sending out invoices. Are they getting paid on time? Are their finances being managed properly, or who's the head of the franchise? So you want to definitely do your research to find out if this is a good business opportunity for you, and perhaps not just dive right into it. So I think that's something that, would be, you want to make an educated determination of whether or not this particular franchise is right for you. Just because it's an established business doesn't mean that it's being run properly. So I think it definitely would do you a good service to do more research and to make sure that this is a worthwhile investment of your time and your money.
Thank you.
Any other questions? You have one, Renee?
Hi, I just wanted to mention, one source of free information. It's called SCORE, SCORE.org. It's very extensive. I found that lead at the library, and they have offices in New York City. They're very helpful. It's retired CEOs, business people that give their time to assist in guiding you as and suggesting. Very good.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
See, I learned something new.
Any other questions from here? Do we have any questions online? No? Okay.
44, okay.
We would like to thank. No. Do we have a question in that or no? No question. Okay. Well, we'd like to thank Mr. Carroll for his time and his wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also thank Joyce Kersey for bringing you from the Capital Regional Chambers.
Yes, definitely. Thank Joyce. Yes.
All right. Okay. So thank you everyone for coming out. We have one more session next week, and that's going to be a virtual tour of a transformed site and the graduation. So, okay. So thank you everyone for being with us. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
good
you.
evening.
Bye.
You
You
too. Have
too.
a good evening.
Yeah.
Great presentation.
Yes. Very. Very resourceful.
Yeah, back through for it.